Hey everyone, this is Nate Van Campen, your classmate, and I'm going to do something a little bit different for my assignment. I thought I would speak through a presentation instead of trying to write some of the details down. I found that the article I chose a little bit dense, and so it needed a bit more explanation than a few slides could show. So I hope it makes sense to you as I go through. So here we go. The article I read is called Social Networking, Multiliteracy Pedagogy, and ELL Writer Identities. I know it's a big mouthful. It was a fairly academic article, but when you start breaking some of these things down, I hope to get us to a place where we're going to be applying the concepts in our own classroom. So let's take a look at the learning goals for this presentation. So by the end of this presentation, I hope you will all understand what multiliteracy is and what writer identity is. I hope you can connect these concepts with the development of English language learner writing and literacy. And then ultimately, I hope you can apply these concepts in your own classroom contexts, whether you're in the primary panel or secondary panel. I think this article that I chose, it talks quite a bit about 6th grade students, but I think it's going to kind of hit younger and lower, so it's a pretty flexible piece. So I hope that's helpful to everybody checking this presentation out. Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna do a bit of a summary of the article, try to kind of unpack the density to you, walk through some of the key terms, which I think will really help us look a little bit at what was studied and the results, not because I'm so concerned about unpacking an academic article and critiquing it in that way, but the actual study they did was a pretty cool poetry unit with ELL students, and so I think there's some things there that we can pull out. There's some pretty neat quotes from the data they collected about students and teachers' reactions to some of this style of learning. And then finally, the last slide, I'm just going to try to take some principles out of the study and riff a little bit about some ideas I might have about where they may apply, stuff that kind of struck me as I read it, and that's how we'll end up. Hopefully there'll be some takeaways for you to go and practice in your own class if that helps you, or if you're a leader of instruction, to help your people kind of have some new ideas on being a more effective literacy teacher with ELL students. So here we go, article overview. The overarching kind of problem this article was trying to tackle was underlying it this idea of stigma. And so it talks a little bit about how English language learners often become marginalized, and because of their lower language skills, but it doesn't mean that they're lower functioning. This occurs because peers and ultimately the student forms a perception of being lower functioning. I kind of summarize it as this leads to the need to access more ways for ELLs to access and communicate their understanding of the world in order to fight the stigmatization. English language learners need to see themselves as people who communicate well across the board, which they do, and there's some ways to tap into this. Ultimately, this positive self-identity will lead to further language development, and that positive self-identity is formed or is accessed when the student lives success and feels empowerment in the way they're learning, and that starts to develop in them. They can say, "Hey, I'm a writer, and I can use English." And so there are some ways that this study and this article kind of addresses how we can get to that. A quote that jumped out at me regarding kind of this idea of an English language learner developing an identity is as follows. As an ELL develops a sense of place and identity in her new setting, a comfort with and desire to use and operate in English emerges. Okay, so let's unpack a few kind of key terms which may help us go a little bit deeper into this article. The first, and they're all formed in the title, but the first one I want to quickly just address is social networking sites. Throughout the article, they refer to them as SNS. I think we all know what these are, but how they apply to learning is an interesting idea. So we define them as online platforms that, when incorporated into the classroom, allow for multimodal meaning making. Wow, that's like a tongue twister. Can maybe use that for speaking practice. Multimodal meaning making through written text, video, images, hyperlinks, and discussion forums. Yeah, I'm totally gonna try to get my ESLCO kids to say that on Monday. And so, things like, we would, in our regular life, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, things like that, but then educational ones that maybe we're using Google Classroom or Glogster, which is kind of making posters. The one the study uses is a new one to me. It's called Ning. I looked into it. It's a little bit to take one step back. It's a service that allows you to create and customize your own social network. So I think that's why they used that for their class. They were able to really develop an online space that was just for their class. So it's quite a bit safer than using like a public platform in terms of privacy and confidentiality, and kind of keeping it within the classroom. So it's kind of just a real online classroom space, similar to Google Classroom, but it's probably a little bit more customizable that way. Okay. The next one, which was a new term to me, I hadn't really run across it in different areas, but once I kind of did a little reading outside of it, I figured out kind of what they mean by it. So it's called multiliteracy pedagogy. And there's kind of four components to multiliteracy pedagogy. This slide I tried to actually embed and exemplify even this presentation overall what multiliteracy pedagogy is. It's this idea that literacy is more than just alphabet or alphabetical reading of a text. There are so many other types of text that we read, such as images, videos, hyperlinks, and written text, comments and dialogue, exchanges on social network, and so it's really taking a bit of a broader look at literacy, and I think it's a really helpful piece when we're thinking about English language learners, because some of these other things are less like language specific, and so it's going to help language learners tap into prior knowledge and feel empowered to communicate well, even if they don't have the right vocabulary or grammatical structures to express the thoughts that they may be experiencing and have in their L1 or their first language. And so it's a way to really draw in their lived experiences and honor who they are as people, and say, yeah, you have important and big ideas to communicate, the same as your classmates. I'll just read a little summary of what I said. This presentation is an example of multiliteracy. We need to help our students understand and create these types of text. It will empower ELLs as it's not solely alphabetically based. This will allow them to tap into their own backgrounds and knowledge, thus removing stigma of being lower functioning, because their English is not the same level as their language one. And so multiliteracy pedagogy, it breaks it down into four steps. So that's where the pedagogy piece comes in, like multiliteracy, I think we get, but there are four components. I think it's not a step. So meaningful practice, overt instruction, critical framing, and transformative practice. I'll go into a little bit more depth using a practical example of what those are. So when we kind of get into what they did in the study, I'll circle back to those four pieces. Just a quick brief explanation of each. Meaningful practice is practice that is based on your own context and has a broader purpose or meaning for language. Overt instruction, so within that meaning, you are still providing vocabulary, grammatical structures for the student to build on, and the notion of scaffolding and the zone of proximal development kind of gets into there. So it's a bit more traditional instruction, but it's embedded within a broader meaning and a bigger meaning. The next step would be critical framing, so that involves quite a bit of self-reflection and kind of saying, who am I as a learner, and then finally the transformative practices where you hope that the student has practiced their own story and has learned something about themselves through this process, and thus being transformed. And that's where the identity comes in. So they have formed a stronger identity of being a successful communicator. Okay. Final definition that I already talked to a little bit about would be writer identities and English language learners. And then it's kind of piggybacks with the SNS. Using SNS tools to create a multiliteracy approach helps ELLs see themselves as creators and users of English texts. It also helps empower online social action to translate into real-life social science, social interaction. So a better way to put that would be they talk about a spillover effect. So when they start to see themselves as having a social place online, they may find a social place in the classroom, and that leads to a decrease of stigmatization. So it really is centered around, can they start to view themselves as people who can create and use in English, and then that will start to change the perception of others around them as their confidence builds. Okay, so practically speaking, what happens? So studies and results. The two kind of research questions that the study starts off with: how can we use multiliteracy pedagogy combined with the use of SNS to facilitate the development of positive and agenitive writer identities for ELLs? I think hopefully that question makes sense now that we've gone through kind of the components of the key terms there. And then, how does the development of a writer identity online impact the social presence of English language learners in the classroom? So that's that spillover piece. So here's how they kind of went about trying to answer those questions. Again, I chose this because it was new. It was kind of local to where we are. So they had three grade 6 classes around the Toronto area, so at the TDSB, I think, and 15% of those 78 students were English language learners who ranged anywhere between levels 2 to 4 in kind of the language acquisition stage, in a broad range of first language in countries of origin, so China, Afghanistan, Iraq, Russia. There was there was a very broad range. And then, so how did they do this? Well, they just led them through a poetry unit, but they did it using various digital platforms to create, post, and share and comment on student poetry. And then it was a case study, as the title says, and so they collected qualitative responses, analyzed them, grouped them into themes, and then pulled some conclusions and implications out of those themes. And some of those qualitative responses, those quotes from teachers and students, are really, really interesting, as we can get into that. Here's just an example of one of the students' poetry, and again, this is going to tie into kind of this multiliteracy pedagogy where they're bringing their own story into it. So, who I want to be an artistic and creative girl, but how can I change myself? I want to be a unique girl and show the world the real me, but how can it all change? Even that poem itself is really getting at the heart of what the pedagogy is all about, of empowering students to bring their stories, the things that they know, the things that they have to offer to the class and to maybe even a broader audience. Again, empowering them to feel, I can communicate, I have important things to communicate even if I don't have a perfect command of my second language yet. And then being able to use graphics and images and other things to enable that is just another tool. So here's what they found. So coming back to the so again, a mouthful of a sentence. Agenitive writing identities. So agency, finding the ability to do this in their identity of saying I can do this. That's kind of what that's referring to. So they kind of went through the four strands of this pedagogy, and I'm going to just kind of walk through them as the example. So the situated practice piece was that the students or considered the students' backgrounds and experience that they brought into the classroom, and they wrote, for example, that one of the poems that two kids, specifically one that I just read, and kind of their two examples that the study highlights is a boy named Benji and a girl named Farah, and they wrote and shared poems that explored their life before and after coming to Canada, thus bringing their story to class. This was empowering for the students, they found. The researchers suggested that more direct teaching, so I gave that a thumbs up. The overt instruction, I put a pin next to it because the researchers, kind of as they observed how the unit was being delivered, they felt like easy fix to do, but there wasn't quite enough direct instruction, and they suggested having a resource teacher maybe work with some of the ELL students to scaffold in some of the more technical writing skills and some of the vocabulary and language pieces, but that would need to definitely be part of this pedagogy to be effective. And they said there was some of that, but they kind of wish, for the sake of the study and for the students benefiting, that they would have had more immediate support and feedback for writing. It's an easy fix, and it can be done next time. The next part was the critical framing. This is I put a bomb. This part bombed for the researchers, they said, because they ran out of time. The teacher had to prep the students for EQAO, so there was no time to go deeper into reflecting on the work they did and the writers they were becoming. However, they did share, Farah did share that her identity did develop, and I'm going to highlight that on the next slide. And then finally, for the transformative practice, this was an encouraging finding. So, and they kind of, I've alluded to this before, but the case in this case, because there was a spillover of social presence online into social presence in the classroom, helped to break some of the stigma and empower the students to become creators of users in English in an academic and non-academic setting. So, some of the data really pointed towards that being a really successful result of using writing poetry. They wrote 5 different poems. Each poem was connected to some sort of multimodal, multiliteracy project, whether it was posting it on and commenting, or creating a poster, or writing from someone else's perspective and putting links and videos and images in. And by kind of using multiple approaches to make meaning, the students, especially through the dialogue online, felt so much more empowered than to connect with their peers in the class, and they started to view themselves as people who are good at communicating who they are, communicating their stories, and drawing meaning from others, which is really kind of what we're hoping our language learners develop when they're learning English. Just to come back to that critical framing quote, Farah said that I learned more about my Iraqi identity, and I learned about my Canadian identity too. I learned more things than I had, and so they just started to scratch the surface of kind of understanding maybe their cultural identity, but and kind of looking how they're situated in their story, but they did not get into maybe their writing identity that with a little bit more depth and time that they may have had. Another quote that works really well for me that's interesting is a teacher reported that the project really leveled things. I think the playing field for some of the students who are ESL students, because they could create fantastic pieces of work. And so just by using the SNS, the social networking platform, along with drawing other types of texts in besides just alphabetical texts, the teachers could see the students creating really high quality work. Um, so that reduced stigma even on the teacher perspective. The classroom teacher was saying, hey, these students, they have a lot to say, and we just have to figure out ways to help them say it. And then when the student experiences that success, they're going to develop more language. And there is a quote, I didn't include it, but that Farah does say that she learned by going online. She learned more new words, she said, in more ways, more new English, because she wanted to communicate with her peers, and she had to. She had to give feedback. Um, and so their conclusions out of this was that multiliteracy pedagogies using an SNS can help ELLs construct positive writer identities, can result in an increase in self-confidence and social presence in their class. And this kind of connects to previous research that indicates these outcomes have a positive effect on ELL writing development. And so I guess what I would say is figuring out ways to kind of use this multiliteracy approach and digging in deep. I know it's a fairly short presentation that I'm giving, but I hope even through the links of this presentation, and I'll link the article in, it's something that you could even dive deep into in your own practice. So what? Implications and applications for ELL teachers and leaders. And so I've just got a few kind of takeaways here. Somewhat unconnected, but just kind of my pullouts and see what I can apply to our different contexts. So the first to me was, there was one quote that I took that stated how important writing for an audience beyond the teacher was for the students to motivate them to communicate well. And I know this is probably applies to all students, not just to ELLs, but this idea of having an audience. It is interesting to think about our ELL students, because that audience becomes riskier when it's in your second language. There's a little graphic here that I like to kind of use when I think about project-based learning that I do in my school and some of the audience pieces. And we talk about on my staff a lot about, as you increase the risk and distance, the motivation and engagement increases. But I would also want to say we want to really be in the right zone on this, to not be so risky that it's crippling, but risky enough that it's motivating and engaging. And so for this project, if you look at the steps, it said present to a teacher to fulfill a requirement is the lowest one. And they said just by using the online community, they presented to their classmates, but not just in front of a presentation in front of a class, but there was dialogue, and I think that was a really important piece. And you could even maybe add a step, kind of online dialogue with classmates. I've also experienced this in mainstream classes and writing classes I've taught, where they post their writing to each other, and when they read it, and they somehow doing it online makes it safer at times, especially earlier on. They're able to kind of engage with feedback, with understanding each other. So I can see how an ELL student having the time, not a real-time conversation, but a time to really think and form what they want to say in an asynchronous environment would kind of thrive with this. So this idea of audience, how can we think about the writing that we do with our ELL students and try to get it past just the teacher reading it, giving some feedback, and improving? How can we think about safe risks for our students for their writing and their speaking? This multimodal pedagogy or multiliteracy really struck me as whether it's reading through multiple ways and teaching students to read multimodal text, or specifically to create content using multimodal things like digital stories. So for example, in my ESL class right now, instead of just writing a short story, they're going to write it. We're going to practice pronunciation and scaffold our speaking skills. They're going to record it similar to how I'm doing right now, add pictures to it, and create a movie which kind of brings and adds some music as well. So if they don't have the vocabulary of a creative writer in their first language, they can use music to set the mood that they may not have the vocabulary words for. And if the story, again, they don't have the description of a scene or a setting, they don't. We're still working on adjectives, but they're not comfortable with that. They can use images to kind of beef up the narrative drama. So I think that's a really interesting way, and I think that's a nice application to a high school panel. All of this, to me, number 3 on my list is project-based learning. It's something that I'm trying to figure out how to do well with English language learners, because there is a lot of inquiry and discovery, which is not easy in your first language. But by reducing maybe the amount of resources for them to look at, layering in more direct instruction rather than self-discovery of learning, but still having the piece of the audience and the product and the multimodal and the creativity, I think really taps into the idea that we can empower students to develop things based on their own stories and their own strengths, like an asset-based approach. Again, direct instruction and scaffolding are embedded in a bigger purpose. To me, that's project-based learning as well, where we have a driving question, a problem to solve, and then within that, we're going to still teach the grammar and the vocabulary they need to create the product that's being asked, or that they want to make, or tell the story that they feel they need to tell, as well as the other skills that go with that. But that's where the teacher can still and should still have direct instruction. But when it's embedded because they need it to do something else, I think it sticks a lot better. And then finally, the last piece, that the biggest takeaway, is this idea of bringing your story into learning and getting students to share their story as much as they're comfortable with, because they're the experts of their own story, and they may feel unconfident if they're learning in their second language, but saying, no, you are an expert on that, and we're going to figure out multimodal ways for you to tell your story and offer it to us. The learning all of a sudden becomes alive, because the student feels, I've got something to learn, and that sense of identity of I am a user of English, and I am a good student, and I am somebody who can create meaning and bring value to people, that gets built, as opposed to it works as like the study used as a counter narrative to the narrative of I'm not very good at school because I'm still learning English and I don't know what's going on here, and so it does work as a really powerful counter narrative to that. So yeah, I feel like I'm still just scratching the surface with this topic, but I hope it's something that you all can take something from and apply to your class, and